Frank Bruni. Welcome to the show.
It's good to be here.
So, your new book, The Age of Grievance, examines how grievance defines our current culture and politics. So, give me an example of where you have seen grievances thriving or even leading the conversation in places that we have not historically seen those before. And, explain the danger you see in that.
Well, I mean, I think we've always seen grievances. And so I don't think anything we're seeing right now is historically anomalous, but it's a matter of degree and it's a matter of pervasiveness. If you look at the MAGA movement, if you look at what happened on January 6th, right, that was certainly beyond the expression of political upset that one normally sees. Um, And in a lot of the MAGA movement, on a lot of the far right of American politics, you find people who not only have legitimate um, qualms about being left out of the economy, about seeing if they're living in certain states, certain areas of the country, seeing manufacturing jobs going away, et cetera. But you see them, and this is what I mean by grievance culture in the book. You see them taking that to extremes and kind of traveling from a reasonable response to an irrational one. You see them moving toward conspiracy theories. You see them indulging the belief that the Dominion voting systems machines were rigged. That is what I think of and what I call in the book grievance run amok. And we see it in its most dangerous forms right now, I think, on the political right. But one of the points I try to make when I'm having these conversations is this is a kind of dynamic in behavior and mindset that spans the ideological spectrum. I don't think its manifestations are as dangerous on the left, not nearly as so. But you see people on the far left using prisms of racism and stuff like that in situations where it's absolutely warranted, necessary, and urgent, and then in situations where it isn't. And that's a kind of grievance run amok.
Is that where you see people overusing the word trauma, for example? Everybody's traumatized by something when, the word trauma has a specific meaning.
Yes, I mean that's an interesting example of it. Yeah, that is something that gets overused. I mean, you just see it's overreactions in various guises of various forms. You see some institutions putting out hurtful or harmful language glossaries that are so long and include stuff that is just so bananas that they end up having to retract what they did. And the problem is you're smiling, I'm smiling inside, we want to chuckle, but it's a problem because we do live in a society where there's terrible racism and we need to address it. We live in a society where there's terrible misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, etc. When you make those complaints in the most overwrought and seemingly frivolous ways, you actually undermine the really important work to be done because you surrender some of your credibility and you give the people who don't want to listen to you and want to tune out, you give them an excuse to. I'll give you a very personal example. Almost all of these hurtful or harmful language initiatives say that you should never say blind study, blind faith, because you're insulting people with vision impairments and disabilities. I had a stroke 5 years ago, lost all vision in my right eye, was told I would live forevermore with a 20% chance of going blind, and I do not see nearly as well as I used to. I am not offended ever by the phrase blind faith or blind study because I understand a metaphor, right? We need to stop waging silly battles so that the serious battles are not undermined.
It's interesting that you mention how grievance can be. I'm going to start that again because we edit. So what you're saying is that grievance need not be bad. And in fact, in the book, you talk about how it's actually the foundation of this country. Can you talk a little bit about how grievance helped drive the American Revolution and how you separate out good grievance from bad?
Well, yeah, so we're a nation born of grievance, right? We believed correctly that our relationship with Britain at the time was a raw deal, right? We've all learned this in the first grades of school, taxation without representation, et cetera. That was a grievance, and it was a righteous one, and it led to the birth of this country. The struggle for civil rights was a kind of grievance, and an urgent, necessary, I mean, beyond urgent and necessary, because a grievance at the end of the day, if you look in the dictionary, is a complaint about what are perceived to be unfair, unjust circumstances. The problem is when you use the word now, like if you finish listening to this podcast and you went on Google and you searched for appearances of grievance within the last week, it is almost always used with a negative connotation in a pejorative context. And that's one of the signals that our complaints have multiplied to a point where almost everything is seen as whiny. A righteous grievance is one that is addressing an injustice that must change and that isn't being adequately recognized, and that without pressure is not going to be addressed. A real injustice affecting many people, and one that is antithetical not just to the good of that group, but to the collective good. A petty grievance is a kind of complaint that doesn't really have public recourse, that is more about the world not evolving, turning out exactly as you wish it would, and a grievance that is disproportionate to the trigger. That's the way I would divide them.
Yeah, it's interesting. You said I was smiling before. I'm vigorously nodding my head for those who can't see what I'm doing, because I'm thinking, though, the problem, or isn't the problem, rather, that in a polarized world that we live in, that we're not agreeing on which are legitimate and which are not. So left-wingers think right-wingers' grievances are wrong and vice versa.
Yes, that is a big problem. And the problem that goes hand in glove with that is nobody wants to listen to or entertain the idea that the other side might have a point, right? We confuse shouting with meaningful conversation. We're living in a political culture right now where many people believe that they who shout the loudest, they who use the most hyperbolic language, they who are the most provocative and confrontational, will win the social media cycle and win the argument. And that's actually not what happens. What happens is we just end up in endless loops of fighting and fighting and fighting. This country is only going to survive and work if each of us recognizes that at any given moment, the country doesn't look exactly as as I individually or you individually might want it to look. That's the nature of a diverse democracy. And the glory of this country is that it is both diverse and a democracy. But if we're going to make that work, if we're going to make the American experiment successful, we need to accord one another a measure of grace, a few dollops of forgiveness. And we need to recognize that no one of us is always right and no one of us is always being wronged. And right now, I think, not among everybody, obviously, but among a perilous share of Americans, there is a pettiness, a narcissism, and a nastiness that are antithetical to meaningful, productive public debate and progress on the issues that demand progress.
Exactly how you tackle that. You have to tackle that on multiple fronts, in social media, as you mentioned, in employment and education and all kinds of places. This podcast, as you know, is called Longer Tables. It's sort of a shorthand for José's idea that you can sit people down at a table and they will find common ground, and that we just really don't do that for many reasons that I don't need to explain to our audience. I noticed in the book that you wrote specifically about Congress and a particular situation in which they who we are constantly and always saying, oh, well, if we leave it to Congress, we're done, were able to kind of turn a high conflict into what you describe as a good conflict. I'm curious if you can explain how that went down.
Yes, I was citing the work and the experience of a terrific journalist named Amanda Ripley, who's written a lot about conflict and conflict resolution over recent years, and wrote a very good book called High Conflict. And she was, based on her work, in conflict resolution. She was actually asked to come testify before Congress and to work with a congressional committee. And as we sit here now, even though it's in the book, in my book, the name of the committee is eluding me. But she and they found that if they literally just toyed with the seating arrangement, so that rather than all Republicans sitting on one side and all Democrats sitting on the other side in a meeting, if they mixed that up, if they did other things that forced people from the opposing parties to interact, and to interact sometimes in ways that weren't charged with politics, right? You mentioned the table, longer tables. One thinks of Thanksgiving, right? The whole point of these holidays where we gather around the table, lots of us, and we put food on the table, it's about sort of shedding the kinds of things that fuel our animosities and sort of getting back to something elemental and truly communal. And, I had a fascinating conversation along these lines with my students. I teach at Duke University, and I taught for the second time this semester a course that is designed to parallel the book, and it's called The Age of Grievance. And one of the students was talking about how in her family there are political opinions that run the gamut, and that's true in my family too. And yet they're not at each other's throats because each of them sees the other as a three-dimensional human being, a complex human being who's more than just politics, and they can sit down at the holiday table at a big feast and they can get through it. And we were all talking as a class, why can't the family of America find that kind of measure of grace when our individual families do it all the time? Now, yes, some have been torn apart by the politics of the last 8 years, and that is one of the aspects of the Age of Grievance that I discuss in the book. But I know as many families who have hung together, and they've hung together because they don't see one another in caricature. And too often right now in our society and our political discourse, everybody is reduced to caricature.
It's interesting. You have as many opinions about the table as you do about politics. I know that many listeners are going to tune into this podcast. I'm sure they'll be thrilled to hear about the book, but because of your background in food and writing about food as well, you were the restaurant critic at the New York Times, which many people would argue is the best job in the whole world. So here's my question. Was it?
It was an amazing job. I've been really lucky. I've had a sequence of great jobs at the New York Times. I don't know if I could say that was the most amazing, but it was a singular adventure that I was delighted to take and am so grateful for having had the opportunity. I mean, it's a pretty great job.
This episode of Longer Tables is sponsored by State Farm. When you get a new car or a new home, the first thing you might find yourself saying is, "I cannot believe it," or "This is incredible." But what you really want to say is the one thing that can get you the help you need. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. State Farm is there with the coverage you need for your car, your home, and even boats, motorcycles, RVs, and other things that matter to you. With a State Farm agent, you know someone is there to help you choose the coverage you need. With so many coverage options, it feels good knowing you can find what works best for you and your needs. And when you need ways to get help, State Farm gives you options there too. Whether it is in person or on the phone with your local agent or on statefarm.com or on their award-winning app, State Farm lets you do things your way. So when you need help protecting the things that matter most, remember to say, like a good neighbor, State Farm is there.
People love reading reviews. They love arguing about reviews. But I think the ones that we all remember are the really bad reviews. I'm thinking particularly in recent years in the New York Times about Pete Wells' review of Guy Fieri's restaurant in Times Square, or there's the famous Ruth Reichel review of Le Cirque. But neither touches, I have to say, in my opinion, your review in 2005 of a restaurant I believe was called Ninja NYC. I still tell people about it. And so I am going to ask you to read an excerpt for those who probably don't remember it quite as well as I do.
I think you remember probably better than I do, but I'm hugely flattered. So, okay, I've got to find the excerpt.
I made it short. I actually, it was much longer. And my editor said, that's a really long excerpt. And I said, but it's such a good review. So,
okay, here goes. Confusing the point of a restaurant with the mission of a Saturday night. I'm sorry, wait, let me start over. Sorry.
okay.
My
Is
glasses.
making you read something sort of not nice of me? I apologize.
No. My glasses were just a little bit askew.
Okay.
Here goes. Confusing the point of a restaurant with the mission of a Saturday Night Live skit, Ninja New York deposits you in a kooky, dreary subterranean labyrinth that seems better suited to coal mining than to supping. You are greeted there by servers in black costumes who ceaselessly bow, regularly yelp, and ever so occasionally tumble, and you are asked to choose between two routes to your table. The first is described by a ninja escort as simple and direct. The second is dark, dangerous, and narrow, involving a long tunnel and a drawbridge that descends only when your escort intones a special command, which he later implores you to keep secret. I recommend a third path, right back out the door.
I remember reading that and just thinking, oh, this is going to be a classic. So I have a question. Was that a high point or a low point for you in your restaurant criticism career?
Well, the meal was certainly not a high point, or I would have given it a much different kind of review. Listen, I think no critic would be honest if she, or they didn't say that the negative reviews are the easier ones to write and are more fun to write. You have to be careful with them, though. I mean, Ninja New York was a well-capitalized and very cynical restaurant. And so I wasn't kind of doing huge economic or moral damage to people who couldn't withstand it. There are a lot of terrible restaurants a restaurant critic has, and you just move on because there's no point in putting a mom and pop restaurant on someone's radar just to trash it and, kind of financially ruin the owners of it. So you kind of save the reviews like the one that I just read, or Pete Wells' of Guy Fieri's restaurant, for the entities that can take it, if you know what I mean.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the follow-up question I was going to have for you was, did you consider not reviewing it? Because of course, what you review and when you review things, it's an art, not a science. I mean, I've done a lot of restaurant reviewing in my life, not for the New York Times, but it is you do have to be careful about what you're spotlighting. And I think people often don't understand the calculations that go into choosing what you're going to review.
Yeah, that's very true. I don't think they have any idea how many restaurant visits a restaurant critic essentially throws away. But I never thought about not reviewing Ninja. There was a lot of advanced press about it. It was a very different kind of restaurant, sort of amusement park meets restaurant, but at a much kind of higher price point than, what was that restaurant called? Mars, whatever. Or, it was doing kind of sushi and Japanese cuisine, but by some sort of Times Square kids ethic. And in fact, my understanding is Ninja not only withstood that review, but prospered over the years because it became a favorite place for like 8-year-old and 9-year-olds to have birthday parties, which right there, it's kind of like wild to think about an expensive sushi restaurant being where a group of eighth graders will, not eighth graders, 8-year-olds will go for a birthday party, but that's how Ninja survived.
Interesting.
Yeah, no, there was a lot of curiosity about that restaurant, and it's important not to be cavalier with people's dreams and fortunes. It's really important. But you're also writing for the reader who might be spending a really meaningful amount of money to themselves, and saying, no, wait a second. So you've got a moral obligation to consumers and to your readers. And you're also there. Part of criticism is you have people who want to read lively, spirited criticism. And that's a constituency that you need to serve too. So there are a lot of different factors that go into it.
Yeah. Well, you got the call to be the dining critic while you were the bureau chief for the New York Times in Rome. And I am going to vote that that is the best job in the world right there. That has my vote. So, do you remember that moment? What went through your head? Had you asked for the job or did someone just call you out of the blue? Tell us what happened.
It was really an out of the blue thing. I had been for about 18 months. I'd been our Rome person, which that may be the best job I ever had at the Times. I mean, I had to do a lot of difficult stuff. I was, because of the direct flight from Rome to Tel Aviv, and because I was a single man without a family or kids or whatever. I was frequently flying to supplement correspondence in Israel, in Gaza. I mean, I've been to Gaza several times. Whenever there were hostilities there, nothing like what we've seen more recently. But so, I mean, there were arduous parts of the job, but it was also a lot of traveling around Italy and writing fascinating features about the people who refused to move from Pompeii, even though like there might be eruptions in the future. Or I remember doing a story on a crackdown on boat speeding in Venice canals. And so for 2 days, I rode around Venice in like police cruisers, I don't know what you even call them, police boats. And yeah, that's not a bad job. That's not
No, it's a
exactly an
good job.
arduous
It is, and
assignment.
there have been times when it has existed and times when it has not. So, so just to get it at all is a coup. But
But
tell us
I
what
was,
happened.
yeah, I was in Italy, and William Grimes, my predecessor as restaurant critic, had decided to leave the job. And I think that happened more quickly than they anticipated. And they were looking for a new restaurant critic. And there was a strain of thought among the people making the decision that it would be interesting if, instead of going with someone who had been reviewing restaurants for years or decades and writing solely about food for years and decades, what about going with someone whom they knew to be baseline knowledgeable about food, whom they knew to be a fervent enthusiast about restaurants, but who was more of a kind of generalist, someone who covered a range of things. And they liked my reporting and writing and thought, what about someone like Frank? And they called me and they said, would you be interested in throwing your hat in the ring, or letting us take your hat and put it in the ring? And I thought, if they think that's sensible and they think that's a good idea, why not? I didn't think anything would come of it. And then they asked me to go write a kind of make believe practice test review. And I went to a new restaurant in Rome, and I went just once, and I wrote a review of it, and they really, really liked it, and they thought more about it. And then one day they said, "Okay, what do you think? What about leaving Rome, coming back to New York, and being our next restaurant critic?" And I thought, that's the craziest thing, which means I should do it.
You know, so you felt strongly, I'm going to ask that again. So you felt instantly like you knew it was the right answer.
I felt instantly like I would be a fool not to seize the opportunity for an adventure like that. And I also felt, listen, the New York Times has its flaws. It's I think the premier news organization in the world. And while it has its flaws, there are a lot of smart people there. And I thought, if a lot of smart people there, knowing how important this position is to readers and to the Times, if they, after much deliberation, think I can do this, I'm going to trust their judgment. And if it doesn't work out, what's the worst that happens? 3 months from now, 6 months from now, we all say, well, that was a interesting idea. It's a shame that it didn't work out. And if it does work out, well, wouldn't that be fantastic? And they approach it very seriously. I disappeared from the paper for about 3 months between my last stories from Italy and my first restaurant review. I went to Paris for 2 weeks and did nothing but eat in restaurants at different levels to make sure I had that yardstick and that vocabulary current. I went back to New York and spent 3 weeks doing nothing but eating in every restaurant that at that moment in time had 4 or 3 or 2 stars from the New York Times, so that I had that yardstick in mind. I went to Hong Kong for a week to just kind of, because that's such a crossroads of all Asian cuisines and traditions. So, I mean, when you strung it all together, it was about 2 months of just eating as education, or as kind of further refresher education. So they're really, I mean, they approached it and I approached it quite rigorously.
So that was the best job in the world right there, where you get to eat, but you don't actually have to write the review or do anything. But,
Yes, the best job
up your
was
game.
preparing. Yeah, the best job was preparing for Restaurant Critic, and yeah, because there were no stakes then. The only stakes were my waistline. But since all I was doing was eating, is I would go to lunch, I would go to the hotel gym treadmill for 3 hours, I go to dinner, rinse and repeat.
Well, it's interesting because, in fact, I asked you that. I was trying to set you up for precisely that question because I know from reading your memoir, Born Round, that you had a very conflicted relationship with food. And, I was curious if that played into your decision to take the job. Can you talk a little bit about how someone who has an uneasy relationship with food is the New York Times dining critic?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I had as a teenager, as a college student, I had eating disorders, and all of my life, and to this day, I struggle with keeping my weight under control. Around the time they asked me to be restaurant critic, I had for several years turned a corner, and really kind of found I was in a very, very healthy place in terms of weight management, in terms of my relationship with food. And I mean, it didn't encourage me to take the job, but I mean, I had to think about that and one of the things, and whether I was doing something extremely dangerous, but one of the things I had learned about my relationship with food is that when I wasn't constantly in a binge purge cycle, but when I was more or less forced to eat at a steady pace, things usually went better. And that's exactly what happened. I actually, during my first couple of years as restaurant critic, I think I lost weight. Um, uh, and I was probably in the best health of my life.
I think that, I mean, in my experience reviewing restaurants, that's the case. You're eating so much, you just need to have a couple of bites of things. You don't ever want to keep eating because there's so much more food coming down the pike that it kind of keeps you in check in a way.
That's
I don't know if you
exactly,
felt that way.
no, that's exactly right. That's exactly how it played out for me. And I wasn't doing sort of between meal snacking. You couldn't, when people, often those of us who struggle with overeating and gain weight, we tell ourselves a lot of lies. I'm going to have two big bowls of buttered popcorn tonight because tomorrow I'm going to fast. If you know that you have to eat out every single night and mini lunches for your job, and to not do that is to literally not be able to do your job. You can't tell yourself those lies of, I'm going to be terrible today and great tomorrow. You have to, all that's available to you is that several bites of each dish rhythm. And you're right. You don't need to eat an entire serving of the roast duck to figure out if it's good or not.
Right.
You have a couple of bites.
So has any of that stuck with you? I mean, I'm curious what your relationship with food is like now that you're back in real life, if you will.
It is better than it was. I mean, sometimes I relapse to the old days. Not really kind of a full relapse, but my relationship with food is better than it was in my youth. It is an ongoing work in progress. But I'm sort of conscious of the dynamics in a way that I wasn't when I was younger. I'm much more honest about my transgressions and the lies. I'm honest about the lies I tell myself when I still tell them. And it's hard to separate out how much of that is age and how much of that is sort of what I learned when I was a professional eater. I think they're both part of it.
This episode of Longer Tables is supported by the 2024 Nissan Pathfinder. I am so excited for Longer Tables to partner with Nissan because, as my listeners know, I love talking with my guests about how food shapes our world and makes us who we are. But I also love hearing people's stories of how they got to where they are today, about the journey itself, and how much joy and adventure we can find within the journey, not just the destination. And there is no better vehicle for chasing bigger, better, and more exciting adventures than the 2024 Nissan Pathfinder. With 7 drive modes, the Pathfinder's available intelligent 4-wheel drive is built for even the most epic journeys. In a Pathfinder, the real fun comes from getting there. That's why we are excited to partner with Nissan to celebrate adventurers everywhere. Thanks again to Nissan for supporting Longer Tables and for the reminder to chase bigger, better, more exciting adventurers and enjoy the ride along the way. Learn more at nissanusa.com.
I have one more food question, and this is to you as a former professional eater and as a very smart journalist, which is I'm curious what your thoughts, and I know this is a big question, but on Ozempic. You know, there's so much discussion about it and how it affects, you know, people's ideas of personal responsibility, or whether they view obesity as a disease and the stigma that accompanies that. Do you ever wish you'd had Ozempic? I mean, would you ever consider taking it? What do you think?
I don't know. You're asking all the right questions. I haven't figured out exactly what I think about Ozempic. I don't take Ozempic. The thought has occurred to me. I can't say I won't. I don't pass judgment on people who do, not at all. And as someone who's struggled with eating and weight, it's a serious challenge that, in many cases, being medicated for it makes as much sense as being medicated for other things. So there's a part of me that feels, why are we seeing, and why am I hearing this impulse to vilify and demonize Ozempic when we don't do the same thing with an analogous drug for another condition? Like, embedded in that impulse is this continued passing of judgment on overweight people as character failures rather than people in the grip of a medical condition. So that really bothers me, and that makes me not want to hate on Ozempic. Yet, what does also strike me and disturb me is how many people of means I see taking it in a very casual way, equating thinness with the kind of advertisement of privilege. There's something disturbing there. So I think where we are right now is the people who really need Ozempic, and for whom I think there isn't that much of a debate, at least with what we know so far medically, and we're going to learn so much more. I mean, we have no idea what's going to happen if someone's on Ozempic for 3 years, right? But I worry that we're in a situation right now which is so emblematic of inequalities in American society, where you have way too many people taking Ozempic for whom it is just the latest Hermes bag, the latest Birkin, right? Except it's a Birkin of the gastrointestinal system. Right. And then we have people who really need it, who aren't getting it, or if they're taking it, still feel like questions are being asked that are passing judgment on the mere fact they need it. And that's really screwy. Like, how is it that a multimillionaire wants people to know that he or she is on Ozempic and super thin and feels like that is a badge of affluence and honor, and someone else feels like, oh, this is I'm going to be looked down on because it came to this? That's just wild. It's wacky.
Yeah, it says so much about the way, you know, our cultures of beauty and the way we judge people and things like that. I mean, for me, the thing that stops me is that it's sort of the magic pill, if you will, and it takes the focus off of the kinds of food that people who are not of means have access to. So it's great that you can eat fewer fast food meals because you're not hungry for them, but you're still not eating a higher quality diet. And it allows us to shift the spotlight away from fundamentally fixing the food system and making sure that people have access to the healthy foods that they need. I don't hear anybody talking about that or the impact that Ozempic is having on sort of where we look for solutions in our food system.
No, that's a great point. But fixing the food system, it's a conversation that people have been having for decades now, and we don't seem very close to it. So, yeah. So, I mean, in the interim, if you are someone who is struggling with obesity, and a kind of obesity. And by the way, I mean, this is a really complicated conversation. There are people who carry around extra weight or even qualify as obese according to like the kind of metrics of that situation, which can be very stringent, who are in very good health. I
Right.
almost said who are otherwise in very good health, and shame on me for almost using the word otherwise. This is a really complicated situation. That said, there are people whose obesity is imperiling their health across a range of fronts. And if they can take Ozempic while we wait for that, I'm afraid to say, mythical day when the food system is fixed, they should be taking Ozempic. And
Correct.
yes, if a side effect of that is that we cut ourselves a break and stop attending to some of those other problems, that's a really terrible side effect. But we should still make sure they have Ozempic in the near term right now.
So, circling back to politics again, yeah, I'm interested in whether you see any connections between the food world and our age of grievance. So, when I started writing about food and when you were the New York Times critic, there was quite a lot of hope, eat local, vote with your fork. Everybody loved the word foodies, even though it's a terrible word. But if you were a foodie, you sort of had a purpose, and now, I don't know, it could be that I'm just getting older, but obsessions with food feel a little to me tinged with decadence, perhaps.
Mm.
It feels harder to enjoy a meal without pondering, the various abuses in the restaurant world. Do you feel like there's any connection between, I mean, first of all, I don't know if you feel that way about the food world, but do you feel there's a connection? Is there just kind of this cloud that is above all of us in whatever we're focused on, and that is part of the age of grievance?
I mean, I see elements and dynamics of the age of grievance in the restaurant scene, restaurant world in a couple of ways. One, and I think it's what you were just getting to, for all sorts of reasons that are not about simple greed or even about greed. Restaurants have become more and more and more expensive, especially high-end restaurants. And a lot has been written about that. Rene Redzepi saying, I can't run Noma like this anymore. We've learned a lot about all of the people essentially economically exploited in order to make those restaurants happen. And so I think in a way that mirrors other aspects of society, access to use of getting the privileged seats in the most expensive rarefied restaurants is one of those things that has become a potent engine of envy in a society where I think more and more we see all around us all of these tiers of privilege in the concert arena, in the restaurant scene, and we're so conscious at all times of who's a tier above us and what that tier gets them. And I think that has happened in the restaurant world in a way that is very much about the economic envy that fuels an age of grievance in our society. But there are also some other interesting things that have happened. I mean, part of grievance is this sensitivity that can bleed into hypersensitivity. And I would argue that the conversation about certain restaurants, certain chefs, certain cookbook authors being guilty of cultural appropriation, I think that those accusations mingle some situations where the charge or the consciousness makes a lot of sense to me with situations where it seems to just be overwrought and indiscriminately applied. That is very much an age of grievance dynamic. So that comes to mind quickly as well.
For just to follow up quickly on that, for people who may not follow this as closely, is there an example you can give of something like that is off the top of your head?
Off the top of my head, I don't keep a file
Yeah,
on
me
on
neither, so I can't
yeah,
bring it up.
but I mean, I think most people have seen or read controversies where a given cookbook author or a given chef or a given restaurant is accused of having no business producing the food it is because it is not of that culture, and so it is exploiting that culture. And the problem I have with that, whether we're talking about restaurants, whether we're talking about literature, is, well, I think it's great that we're having the conversation that people who are most intimate with a culture and who are the real experts on it should not be left out of or should not be sidelined in that culture's presentation, whether it be in a restaurant, in a novel, whatever. I also think that we are sometimes calling cultural appropriation what I would actually call tribute, right? Um, where's the line between paying tribute to a culture and, in fact, giving it exposure and being guilty of a cynical appropriation? Often that line is in the eye of the beholder, and often that conversation can come to seem so obsessive, to use a word that you used before, so overwrought, so hypersensitive, that it becomes yet another one of those ways in which we all just kind of shut down and stop listening to one another.
Hmm. I want to end with a reference to another book that you wrote that we haven't really had time to discuss, The Beauty of Dusk, which tells the story about how you lost sight in your right eye, I believe, and the adaptations that you had to make to your work, to your personal life, but I think maybe mostly to your attitude in this age of grievance. Has that experience helped you to remain hopeful?
Absolutely. And there's, thank you for asking about that, because there's some real connective tissue in my mind and in my heart between The Beauty of Dusk, which is a memoir about a very unusual medical ordeal I went through in a new kind of way I have to live, a more limited way. There's some connective tissue between that and The Age of Grievance. And it's this, we have to be careful about how much time we spend measuring our misfortunes and stewing about them. And we need to make sure that when we are measuring our misfortunes and stewing about them, we're doing it in a productive way, and we're not kind of ending up in a cycle of obsession that just makes us unhappy, and that's destructive. And partly what I had to learn to do in the private realm, which was not focus on what I'd been denied, not focus on what had been taken from me, but focus on all the blessings that remained. At times, we have to do a version of that in the public realm. And I say at times, it's really important to qualify it, because I'm not saying that if you are discriminated against, shut out from the kind of opportunity that other people are, you should just say, oh, well, other things in my life are going great. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying there are a lot of us, there are a lot of people out there who are outraged over things that don't warrant outrage, who are obsessed with ways they feel they've been shortchanged, that are obsessions and not kind of healthy preoccupations. And that is just not a productive way to live, and it is not the wellspring of contentment. And that's something that my kind of personal journey, I think, has sensitized me to when I look at our completely dysfunctional civic discourse. I mean, civic discourse can't even, the phrase doesn't apply, when I look at our utterly broken politics.
Frank Bruni, thank you very much for being on Longer Tables.
Thank you for inviting me.